Other key works. 1977 In the Heart of the Country, 1980 Waiting for the Barbarians, 1983 Life and Times of Michael K. 1986 Foe. 1990 Age of Iron. See also, The Story of an African Farm Cry, The Beloved Country, A Dry White Season. In context. Focus multiculturalism. Before 1979 a Black Power group takes over the basement in Moses Ascending, Trinidad-born Sam Selvon's Tales of a West Indian Landlord in London. 1987 Michael Ondaatje, a Sri Lanka-born Canadian writer, weaves native cultures into rich storytelling about the lives of immigrant laborers in Toronto in the Skin of a Lion. 1991 Renaud de Merken's semi-autobiographical account of conflicting loyalties in a Turkish family in Germany, Schwarzer T.mit Drei Stuckzucker, becomes a bestseller. After 2004 Small Island English author Andrea Levy's story of the lives of two couples sheds light on the migrant experience in post-war Britain. Immigration has been a major part of the cultural fabric of the USA, Canada, and the UK for generations, but recent decades have seen a surge of new writing that reflects both the diversity of their populations and the ubiquity of English. The need to assimilate into a new culture tends to suppress migrant voices, so it is often the second generation in immigrant families who are strongly motivated to write stories that reflect the fusion of their cultures. This in part explains the slower emergence of multicultural writing in the rest of Europe and around the world, but as other nations become more diverse, new voices start to be heard. In Germany, for instance, Renaud de Merken has paved the way for Turkish-German writing. In the UK, multicultural literature goes back to major waves of immigration from the Commonwealth in the 1950s, and often brings a troubled, xenophobic space into sharp focus, revealing the lives of people of multiple ethnic groups in major cities. As elsewhere, many mixed-race and second-generation immigrant authors penned first novels that dwell on the integration of diaspora communities. Zadie Smith's award-winning book White Teeth offers a fresh, youthful perspective on the complex inheritance of multicultural families in North London. White Teeth. Melting Pot Britain. White Teeth stretches back to the last days of World War II, when the English white working-class Archie Jones is paired with a Bangladeshi Muslim wireless engineer called Samad Iqbal in a British Army tank unit in Greece. The friendship, crossing class and color lines, continues after the war. The bond is cemented by long afternoons in an Arab-run Irish pub, marital discord, and late-in-life fatherhood for both men. Samad has twin boys, Majid and Millat. Through his arranged marriage with Alsana, Archie and his Jamaican-born wife Clara have a daughter named Iree. Samad, now a curry shifter in a local restaurant, decides to send his son Majid back to Bangladesh to have him raised with a respect for his Muslim heritage, but when Majid returns years later, it is as a secular scientist. By ironic contrast, his twin, wild child Millat, joins a Muslim fundamentalist group. Iree is drawn to her mother's homeland through her grandmother. Millat, Majid, and Iree struggle, as their parents do, with the feeling that they belong nowhere, in contrast to those that have lived in Britain for generations and enjoy the luxury of history and entitlement. There was England, a gigantic mirror, and there was Iree, without reflection. Smith has an ear for dialogue, and eyes everywhere, cataloging assaults on immigrant communities, comprehensive schools awash with hash, and the chattering middle classes, as epitomized by the intellectual white Chalfin family, who exert an inexorable influence on Iree, Millat, and Majid. Set in part during the Thatcher years, the 1980s, the book is dotted with cultural references, from Salman Rushdie's fatwa to street crews in Nike gear. Smith has criticized her undergraduate novel, but it remains a feisty chronicle of a time that demanded new definitions of what it was to be British. In White Teeth, the network of relationships among whites, first-generation immigrants, and their British-born children reflects the changing nature of British society. Zadie Smith. Zadie Smith was born in North London in 1975 to an English father and a Jamaican mother. Originally named Sadie, she changed her name to Zadie aged 14. Smith wrote her acclaimed first novel White Teeth during her final year at King's College, Cambridge. Moving to the USA, She studied at Harvard and taught creative writing at Columbia University School of Fine Arts before taking her current post at New York University. She divides her time between New York and London, with her husband, writer Nick Laird, and their 2 children. Smith has received nearly 20 nominations and awards for her writing. In recent years she has branched into short stories and critical essays. In an article in the Guardian newspaper she was asked to give her 10 golden rules for writing fiction, which included, tell the truth through whichever veil comes to hand, but tell it. Other key works. 2002 The Autograph Man, 2005 On Beauty, 2012 NW. See also, Cry, The Beloved Country, A House for Mr. Biswas, Interpreter of Maladies, Life of Pi the Kite Runner, Half of a Yellow Sun. In context. Focus. Southern Ontario Gothic. Before 1832, considered the first Canadian novel, Wacusta by John Richardson, is full of menace and Gothic terror. 1967 Timothy Findley's The Last of the Crazy People is published. 5 years later the author coins the term Southern Ontario Gothic to describe his novel. 1970 Robertson Davies' Fifth Business is an early example of Southern Ontario Gothic, looking at the dark underbelly of an Ontario community. After 2009 Intrigue, Murder, and Fear infuse Alice Munro's Gothic short story collection Too Much Happiness. 2013 Hilary Sharper's Perdita, which she describes as eco-Gothic, is a modern Canadian ghost story. The Gothic fiction of the 18th and 19th centuries typically featured such elements as haunted castles, tyrannical villains, endangered heroines, mysteries, and ghosts. In the late 20th century, Canada, and Southern Ontario in particular, developed its own take on this tradition. Novelists including Alice Munro, Robertson Davies, and Margaret Atwood appropriated aspects of Gothic fiction such as the supernatural and the grotesque, and the genre's dark imagery, and applied them to contemporary Canadian life. Frequently, such literature attempts to make sense of Canadian national identity in a post-colonial context, and can be seen as a reflection of settlers' anxieties about their history. Darkness moved closer. Back into the long shadows cast by Laura. The Blind Assassin. Narrative complexity. Margaret Atwood relocates the fascination with fear and terror that fed the European Gothic to her own home territory, exploring the darker side of human nature and the destructive potential of buried secrets. Her book The Blind Assassin is a notable example of Southern Ontario Gothic, playing on notions of sacrifice and betrayal, truth and lies, conspiracy and romance, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. The novel is a multi-layered story told through the eyes of 83-year-old Iris Chase Griffin, writing her memoirs in the form of a letter to her granddaughter. Within the story of Iris's life another novel is nestled, also called The Blind Assassin, about 2 lovers, and purportedly written by Iris's sister, Laura. And within that novel is yet another story, a pulp science fiction tale related by the man in Laura's novel. All these stories are punctuated by newspaper reports that add a further, supposedly factual, dimension to the narrative. The main story, recounted in Iris's memoir, revolves around Laura and Iris Chase in the 1920s and 30s. Gothic motifs are updated, the haunted castle becomes Iris's family home, Avilion, a mansion built by her rich grandfather, complete with attics and turrets. There is a cruel male villain in Iris's domineering husband, Richard, and Iris and Laura themselves are versions of the victimized heroine. Haunted by the real. The novel is realistic in tone, yet symbolically the supernatural is never far away. The structure of flashbacks means that characters we know to be dead appear almost as if they are ghosts speaking to the present from the past. Laura, whose suicide the reader learns about in the very first sentence, haunts Iris through memories and secrets that are slowly uncovered. Southern Ontario is itself a dark and brooding character in the book. It may be likened to the underworld of classical literature. Ominous stretches of water must be crossed in order to enter it, and it has its own villainous gatekeeper, in the form of Richard. The protagonists wander here in search of meaning. Overall, Atwood's reworking of Gothic tropes and her skillful interweaving of different genres creates a novel in which, despite the darkness, each element illuminates the whole. The structure of The Blind Assassin, with its stories within stories and multiple narrators, echoes Gothic literature, while the third tale, although set on the planet Zychron, contains the familiar Gothic elements of romance, betrayal, and murder. Margaret Atwood. The Canadian novelist, poet, and essayist Margaret Atwood was born in 1939 in Ottawa, Ontario. For much of her childhood, she spent half the year in the wilderness, where her father studied insects. During this time she would write poems, plays, and comics, and while still at school she decided to become a writer. The U.S. writer Edgar Allan Poe was among her favorite authors, and his dark influence can be seen in much of her fiction. Atwood's first publication was a collection of poems in 1966, but she is best known as a novelist. Her first novel to be published was The Edible Woman in 1969. Her passion for environmental issues and human rights comes through in her dystopian novels such as The Handmaid's Tale and the trilogy begun with Oryx and Crake. She has received many distinguished literary prizes, including the Booker Prize for The Blind Assassin. Other key works: 1985 The Handmaid's Tale, 1988 Cat's Eye, 1996 Alias Grace, 2003 Oryx and Crake. See also Frankenstein, Dracula, Wuthering Heights, The Handmaid's Tale Selected Stories. In context. Focus. Dysfunction in the modern family before 1951. In J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, Holden Caulfield is lonely and alienated yet consumed by thoughts of his family. 1960 The first novel of John Updike's Rabbit series is published, dramatizing family turmoil in contemporary USA. 1993 In The Virgin Suicides, Jeffrey Eugenides tracks the unexplained suicides of 5 teenage sisters. After 2003 In We Need to Talk About Kevin, Lionel Shriver tackles the subject of parenting a child who becomes a mass murderer. 2013 Theo Decker, the narrator of Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch, describes a family shattered by alcoholism and loss. The title of Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections echoes that of William Gaddis's The Recognitions, which features a restless son searching for authenticity and contemplating his relationship with his father, who is losing his mind. As in The Corrections, the scope of The Recognitions extends to a wider cast of characters and tells the story of a single family by weaving narrative threads to garner multiple viewpoints. Since the late 20th century, the theme of the dysfunctional family has often been at the heart of work by great U.S. male novelists, such as John Updike, Philip Roth, and Don DeLillo. As well as Gaddis, many of them would likely feature in Franzen's literary ancestry. The Corrections tells the stories of the Lamberts, Alfred, Enid, and their adult children Gary, Chip, and Denise. This is a family tested by individual needs set against differing notions of the familial unit, values, and rights, all played out against a backdrop of a U.S. economy dominated by capitalist-driven high-tech and financial sectors. As the saga unfolds, the text achieves acute political and social insights, touching on wide-ranging themes, from financial misdoings and gun death to food and children's literature. Suspense and narrative drive come from the family's attempt to have one last Christmas together and the unfolding brutality of degenerative disease. The personal lives of the main characters are all marked by instability, whether it be professional, romantic, or mental. He became agitated whenever they were going to see their children. The Corrections. Generational change. Through his depiction of 2 generations, Franzen is able to reflect societal change over the period of a lifetime. Alfred, the repressed patriarch, identifies with a past order. His sections are punctuated with quotes from Schopenhauer and illuminated by recalled scenes from Midwest America in the mid-20th century, when he worked as a rail engineer. Gary, Chip, and Denise inhabit a much less tractable world. Their experiences distill the pressures and vicissitudes of the increasingly troubled late 20th century. Genetics aside, there is a common link between all of them. Despite neuroses and flaws, they all have hope of improvement. Even Alfred, unwavering in his self-belief and certainty that family ties and emotion have to be sacrificed to fully contribute to civilization, reflects, while Enid is pregnant with their youngest child, Denise, a last child was a last opportunity to learn from one's mistakes and make corrections, and he resolved to seize this opportunity. Franzen later published a memoir called The Discomfort Zone, which included an intimate exploration of the impact of his mother's death. This eclectic collection reveals that the notion of family still dominates his work. Jonathan Franzen. Jonathan Earl Franzen's father was a civil engineer and his mother, Irene, was a homemaker. Franzen grew up in Chicago and graduated in German from Swarthmore College, Pennsylvania, USA, in 1981. He married Valerie Cornell at the age of 23, they divorced 14 years later. He is now in a relationship with the writer Catherine Chetkovich, and lives in New York and California. In 2001, Franzen sparked a feud with U.S. talk show host Oprah Winfrey when he voiced unease at the choice of the corrections for her book club, fearing that men would be put off reading it. He continues to write on a range of topics, including the pitiful state of Europe and the impermanence of e-books. Franzen won the National Book Award for Fiction in 2001 with The Corrections, which was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Other key works: 1992 Strong Motion, 2006 The Discomfort Zone, A Personal History, 2010 Freedom, see also, The Catcher in the Rye, White Teeth. In context. Focus. The 38th Parallel, Before 1893 literature in Korea emerges from the cultural shadow cast by classical Chinese literature. The first Western work of fiction printed in Korean is John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, which precedes even a translation of the Bible, published in 1910. 1985 Hwang Sok-young's The Shadow of Arms is an account of black market trading during the war in Vietnam. 1964, 94 Park Kyung-in-ai's epic 16-volume historical novel The Land depicts the struggles of Koreans under Japanese oppression. After 2005 North and South Korean authors attend a joint literary congress for the first time. After Japan's surrender at the end of World War II, a line of latitude that crosses the Korean peninsula, the 38th parallel, was chosen as the dividing line between Soviet and U.S. occupation zones, and is still roughly in effect as the border between North and South Korea. The post-war generation of South Korean writers embraced a traditionalist movement that looked back at an idealized past. But this nostalgia was rejected by the writers of the 1960s, who sought to engage with the psychological damage of recent Korean history, the Japanese occupation, the Korean War, and communist rule in the North. Evils from Abroad. In his novel The Guest, Hwang Sok-young deals with the real-life Korean War massacre at Sinchon, in what is now North Korea. The novel's Korean-born protagonist, a Christian minister living in the USA, returns to visit the site, along with the ghost of his brother. He discovers the truth of the atrocity. It was not perpetrated by U.S. forces, but was a result of fighting between Christian and communist Koreans themselves. Christianity and communism are seen as foreign guests that have turned Koreans against each other, and the Korean word for guest refers also to smallpox, another plague from the West that ravaged the country. The novel's 12-part structure mirrors that of a shamanistic ritual to cure smallpox, known as a guest exorcism. Ever since we were children we have known that the guest is a Western disease. The Guest. See also, The Heartless. In context. Focus. Post 9/11 America Before 2001 Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections, published on September 11, 2001, foreshadows the concerns of U.S. literature after 9/11. After 2007 Don DeLillo's Falling Man is published, detailing the effects of the World Trade Center attacks on the life of a middle-class survivor. 2007 Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist depicts the way in which a middle-class Pakistani-American financial analyst is drawn towards radicalization. 2013 Thomas Pynchon's Bleeding Edge is published, a lively novel touching on financial malfeasance during the dot-com boom, in which 9/11 takes place more than halfway through the story. The terrorist attacks in New York and Washington on September 11, 2001 caused a huge change in the political and cultural landscape, which literature was sure to tackle sooner or later. But at first many authors struggled with its enormity. After the attacks, leading novelists Martin Amis, Ian McEwan, and Don DeLillo all commented on how the nature of their job felt as if it had changed and become more difficult in ways they did not yet understand. Authors chose different methods to try to make sense of the topic. A New Way of Looking. In Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, Jonathan Safran Foer explores the aftereffects of 9/11 through a young boy, Oscar Schell. 9 months after the attacks, in which his father was killed, Oscar suffers from a depression, which he says is like wearing heavy boots. Finding a key left by his father, he embarks on a quest around New York to discover what the key is for, meeting many curious characters along the way. The novel contains unusual stylistic choices. Pages are black, or several in a row are left white, words are circled in red, and many photographs appear, of objects, famous personalities, and the Twin Towers themselves. Through such techniques, Safran Foer tries to make us look afresh at 9/11, to find a new way of seeing something so terrible that has also become so familiar. There are so many times when you need to make a quick escape, but humans don't have their own wings, or not yet, anyway. Extremely loud and incredibly close. See also, The Corrections, The Reluctant Fundamentalist.